Another video in my series on why Christian apologetics are so bad. This is a video from a YouTube channel called So Be It, run by Jeff Morgan, Alicia Lazarus, and Ariel Randall. It appears to be under the Jews for Jesus umbrella. If you like my video, please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks.
At Devu Random. This person says the New Testament often misquotes or takes Hebrew Bible scripture out of its context, with Isaiah 7:14 being a prime example. In the Hebrew text, the word alma means young woman. It does not imply virginity. The context is a prophecy given to King Ahaz, referring to a specific event during Isaiah's time. The prophecy was a sign that the Assyrian threat would end, and the young woman mentioned was already pregnant, making the idea of a virgin birth unrelated to the original text. Where Christians go wrong and are led astray by Greco-Roman pagan idolatry, they rely on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, alma was rendered as parthenos, a Greek word that can mean virgin or young woman, depending on the context, in all caps. This translation was later used in the Gospel of Matthew to support the idea of Jesus' virgin birth. Despite this, the Greek cannot override the original Hebrew's meaning and context, which clearly indicates a young woman and not a miraculous virgin conception. There's more. The New Testament authors, heavily influenced by the Septuagint, reinterpreted Isaiah 7:14 to align with Christian virgin birth theology, but this reinterpretation ignores the historical and cultural context of the Hebrew Bible. For Hebrew-speaking Jews, the original meaning of this passage is unmistakably about a child born in Isaiah's time, with the two names given to the child. This is funny. Emmanuel is only one of the two names, Cupcake. I guess they were referring to me.
Everybody's so creative, huh?
Yeah, as a sign to King Ahaz, with no connection to a messianic prophecy centuries later. The Christian adaptation of the verse is a clear example of scripture being taken out of its original context. Keep your false doctrines and your fake theology away from Jews. We don't need it. I'll stop to breathe for a second there. That was a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. Okay.
And with a long and in-depth comment that makes a lot of claims, we have to kind of address those. And if there's anything that you'd like to say first off, let me know. If not, I'll jump right into Isaiah 7:14.
No, you should lead us through this, Jeff, because I know you've studied this pretty extensively. I'm really interested for you to unpack.
And the thing is about that is that you can study these passages intensively and deeply and come up with different conclusions.
Well, that's certainly true. Many prophecies are pretty vague and often contain jarring and unusual imagery or actions, but in most cases, it's at least clear what the purpose of the prophecy is and what context or problem it's meant to address.
And so I think that's where the big argument between Jew and Jew comes in this situation, is that we're all studying this. At least some of us, at least we're trying to be authentic in the way that we present our faith and beliefs, and have come up with a conclusion and have come to conclusions, and other people have come to different conclusions, and that's why we're here to bring these things up. And so I'm going to read Isaiah 7:14, the famous prophecy. It says, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the Alma shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." In English, it would read, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God is with us. So, since a miraculous sign is being given, it would make little sense for an ordinary young woman who is already married or expecting to be the subject of a prophecy.
I don't see why. Many prophecies contain references to mundane objects. But anyway, the woman is certainly not the subject of the prophecy. The subject of the prophecy is the two kingdoms that King Ahaz expects to imminently attack Judah and destroy it. The woman is just a literary device. We have no idea if there was an actual woman, if it was a particular woman, if Isaiah was just pointing to some pregnant woman walking down the street, whether the woman was his own wife, whether this or anything else was actually spoken to King Ahaz, or whether it was just written down later. Really, who knows? However, the prophecy is about the two kingdoms, not about the woman. The role of the pregnant woman is to highlight the speed with which these two kingdoms will be destroyed, before the child knows good and bad, which probably means something like 2 years. And here's the most important point, I think. There is nothing whatsoever to indicate that this prophecy refers to anything beyond the current political predicament, the alliance of the two kingdoms that threatens Judah. The prophecy promises a resolution within a few years. That's it. If you think the prophecy is actually about a woman who will be alive 700 years in the future, you have a huge amount of explaining to do. Why is the prophecy delivered to King Ahaz? Why does it discuss the two kingdoms that are threatening Judah? Why doesn't it tell us anything specific about the woman or the child? Why is the child supposed to be named Emmanuel and not Jesus? Why doesn't Isaiah indicate that this is a far future prophecy? And if the birth was genuinely special in the way you imagine, that is, impregnation by the deity, something nowhere else reported in Jewish scripture, and that was the whole point of the prophecy, don't you think that's something that Isaiah would have called attention to? I mean, I would think so. There's actually a very similar prophecy in chapter 8, where Isaiah says he impregnated a Neviah, or prophetess. No indication he was married to her, by the way. And the child will be given a certain meaningful name, and by the time the boy can speak, the two kingdoms will be destroyed. It's basically the same prophecy. Maybe it's the same woman as the other prophecy. Maybe it's the same kid. Maybe it's Isaiah's own wife in both cases. Who knows? If the compiler of the book of Isaiah had placed the Neviah prophecy before the Alma prophecy, we'd certainly be tempted to think they are the same person, whether real or metaphorical, in both cases impregnated by the prophet himself, just as in the case of the prophecy from the first chapter of Hosea, where the prophet is commanded to marry a prostitute and give names to the children that represent key aspects of the prophecy. In any case, the Isaiah prophecies certainly have echoes of the repeated birth described by Isaiah's slightly older contemporary Hosea. It's not some kind of startling departure from prophetic formulas. The use of pregnancy as a metaphor for the future is really too obvious to require further discussion.
This actually supports the understanding that Alma can and does refer to a virgin here.
Sorry, what supports what? The woman is not the subject of the prophecy, just like the prostitute that the prophet Hosea is commanded to take is not the subject of that prophecy. It's a literary device to make the prophecy more vivid. Get a prostitute, because Israel is like a prostitute. Look at the pregnant woman, because your enemies will be destroyed before her child is weaned. It's a rhetorical device.
So the claim that Isaiah 7:14 was misquoted ignores the facts simply. While Alma can mean young woman, it's never used for a married woman in the Tanakh.
First of all, who said she's married? Prostitution and out-of-wedlock sex were a thing even back in the Bible, and there was no birth control, so she could very well not have been married. But again, she was probably neither married nor unmarried because she didn't actually exist. She is a rhetorical device. As far as the term Alma, it's actually hardly used in Tanakh. In Exodus 2:8, it's clearly a child or adolescent, baby Moses' older sister, and virginity is not at play in the narrative. The instance of Alma in Genesis 24:43 is Abraham's servant retelling to Bethuel his prayer from verse 14. The parallel term in the earlier verse is Na'ara, which just means young female without any sexual reference. It's the female equivalent of Na'ar, which is a male youth. In fact, the term that nails down Rebekah's virginity status in this narrative is that term, Betula. That's the term you use if you want to be clear about the biological state of affairs. Alamot in Song of Songs 1:3 would presumably refer to unmarried women, although it doesn't indicate virginity. And who knows what this verse is talking about anyway. Verse 6:8 is also rather unclear. All we know is these are women who are not queens or concubines. In Proverbs 30:19, the term just seems to mean woman. Psalm 68:26 would also seem not to indicate anything about the virginity of the subjects. And that's basically all of the occurrences of Alma that I can see. So I think all you can conclude really is that Alma refers to a young woman. But we could lean in the direction of being unmarried. I think that seems reasonable.
And in every instance, it refers to an unmarried girl.
That's not totally clear, as I said, but again, we can lean in the direction of Alma being an unmarried woman.
Strongly implies virginity. If you look in Genesis 24, verse 43, Exodus 2, verse 8, Proverbs 30 through 30, verse 19, you see examples of the word being used in relation to the women that were virgins at the time, unmarried young women. And in that culture, it was very typical and expected that a unmarried young woman would be a virgin because because having premarital relations would go completely against the cultural, not only traditions, but the religious practices of the time.
I mean, sure, but the Bible is very familiar with prostitutes and adulterers and widows as well. And the prophets especially were eager to compare Israel and Judah to prostitutes or faithless partners. So what is the reason to think that this fictional woman is a virgin based just on the term Alma? And there's something that argues very strongly against this fictional woman being a virgin. You might have guessed it already. She's pregnant. Pregnant women are not virgins. If the context is a pregnant woman, then we can conclude that the young woman is not, in fact, a virgin. Now, you can argue, well, it would be unusual to have an unmarried woman who is not a virgin in an ancient Israelite setting. That situation might have some negative cultural consequences. Women in that situation might be marginalized or ostracized. So, a typical unmarried woman would in most cases be a virgin. Okay, that's reasonable. An unmarried pregnant woman might be unusual in ancient Israel, but it certainly happened in an era with no birth control. But you know what didn't happen, even back then? Women getting pregnant without having sex. So even if we imagine this woman was a real woman, and even if she was unmarried, there is still zero chance that she was a virgin. Any other explanation is infinitely more likely.
And there were pretty severe consequences for those women that would have premarital relations. So I want to address the part of this comment that talks about, I'm just going to reread it, where Christians go wrong and are led astray by Greco-Roman pagan idolatry. They rely on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Alma was rendered as Parthenos, a Greek word that can mean virgin or young woman, depending on the context. So when this person talks about they're relying on the Septuagint, the Greek translation, well, who wrote the Greek translation?
The Jewish scholars of the day.
Yeah, Jewish scholars.
Well, we don't actually have any idea who wrote the translation of Isaiah into Greek. All we can say is it was someone who knew both Hebrew and Greek. Beyond that, we are rather in the dark.
Jewish scholars wrote a century to 2 centuries before Jesus came. They translated this into virgin, or Parthenos in the Greek.
Actually, we don't know that either. The earliest manuscripts of the Septuagint we have are from the 4th century CE, which is hundreds of years after it stopped being a Jewish concern in any significant way. So we simply don't know that that was the original translation.
And so when the person says they're depending on the Greek translation, I think it's kind of a misguided statement, because it's trying to get you to think that, oh, the Greco-Roman influence and the pagan idolatry, that those are the ones that translated this. But it's not. It's the Hebrew scholars or the Jewish scholars that recognized that because Greek was the language that connected people at the time, and it was a very widely spoken language, that would be beneficial for the Jewish people to have a Bible or a Hebrew Bible in Greek.
Yes, I think we can assume that was the original motivation, but the Jewish community of Alexandria was basically gone by the year 100 CE, And the Greek language lost any currency among the Jews, so we have a translation made by unknown people into a language that rapidly became of interest only to Christians, and Christians became the caretakers of the Septuagint.
And so if somebody out there doesn't know what the Septuagint is, again, it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible completed between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Torah, or the first 5 books, around 250 BC, with the rest completed by the 2nd century BC.
Well, and the reason that it's so significant is because, to your point about they translated this word as virgin.
No, they didn't. Virgin is an English word taken from the Latin. Your partner there said that the translation of Parthenos can mean virgin, but we cannot confirm that Parthenos was even the original translation.
The Septuagint helps us understand how people at the time, in the era right before Jesus came, were interpreting the scriptures.
That's a fair statement. The Septuagint helps us. On the other hand, rabbinical Jews were also people of the time and never accepted the Septuagint translation as Holy Scripture or even as an aid to understanding Holy Scripture. And again, we don't have the original Septuagint. Targum Jonathan from the 2nd century translates the term Alma in Isaiah 7:14 into the Aramaic Ulemta. If we look at his use of this term throughout his translation, it does not seem to exclusively imply a virgin, but rather just a young woman. For example, in 1 Kings 1:2, Na'ara Betula, or young virgin, is translated into the Aramaic Ulemta Betulta. The Hebrew term Betula is translated as Betulta, or virgin, and the term Na'ara is translated as Ulemta, or young female. It's hard to imagine Ulemta meaning virgin in this context because the translation would then yield virgin virgin. So as far as Jonathan and his readers were concerned, I think we can say that Alma could reasonably be understood to mean just young woman.
Right? It gives us like
Yeah.
a window to that chapter.
Yeah, they weren't just translating in a vacuum. They were translating completely in tune with Jewish culture, Jewish theology, and the Jewish narrative of the Tanakh and the Old Testament that they were practicing reading and following and going to synagogue and hearing.
I'm gonna go with bullshit on that one. You don't know who made the translation of Isaiah, or exactly why, or exactly what community concerns this translation reflected. The Alexandrian Jewish community was probably not typical of the Jewish world at that time, which was adopting Aramaic as the language of daily life. The general sense you get from a writer such as Philo is that the Alexandrian community was more steeped in Greek culture than in Jewish culture and had grown seriously disconnected from the Hebrew language and Jewish traditions.
And these were the people that translated these Hebrew words into Greek. Like, for instance, the word Messiah was translated into Christos in Greek, which is where we get the word Christ and Christianity from.
Right.
And so when we ask people on the streets, what do you think the word Christ means? They'll usually say cross, but they just don't realize that it was a Greek rendering of the Hebrew word for Messiah.
So, what's the point?
I'm pretty sure a lot of people are still thinking that it's Jesus' last name, Jesus Christ.
Right.
JC.
Right. Yep. The Septuagint was widely used by Greek-speaking Jews, including during the time of Jesus. And many New Testament references to the Old Testament come from the Septuagint. The second point about that is the word Alma and Parthenos in Isaiah 7:14. It states, "Behold, the Alma, or virgin, shall conceive and bear a son."
That's what the Septuagint says, but the Hebrew text we have says that the woman is pregnant already. We have Hebrew manuscripts of this reading that predate our Septuagint manuscripts by hundreds of years. Are you contending the Hebrew reading is in error, and if so, on what basis?
The Hebrew word Alma means a young woman of marriable age, often understood as a virgin unless otherwise stated.
Otherwise stated, like saying she's currently pregnant?
The Hebrew word betula, and this is where we get it. You know, a lot of people will say, well, betula is the word for virgin in Hebrew. It is, and it is the word for betula is the word exclusively used in modern Hebrew for a virgin. But when the word betula was used in the Hebrew scriptures, in many cases it had a qualifying statement attached to it. For example, in Genesis 24:16, Rebekah is described as a Betula. And the phrase, whom no man had known, is added onto that to confirm her virginity. So this shows that Betula alone could be ambiguous, requiring further clarifications.
I'm gonna call this bullshit. First of all, in the instance you give, if Alma were the correct word for virgin, why wouldn't it just say Alma here? Clearly, that would not convey what the author intended. And as I mentioned before, the term in this very narrative that pins down Rebekah's sexual status is exactly this term, Betula. In this narrative, she is also called an Alma and a Na'ara, but the term the narrator uses to describe her sexual status is in fact right in this verse, Betula. But to your point about Betula requiring additional qualifications to indicate virginity, there are actually many uses of the term Betula in Tanakh. Sepharia returns 50 hits, and they are almost never qualified in the way you mention. Let's go over just a few. Leviticus 21:14. Only a virgin of his own kin may he take as wife. No qualification for Betula. And here it cannot be talking about other circumstances in which a woman might be unmarried, because those circumstances are explicitly accounted for in the passage. Betula must mean exactly sexual virgin. The discussion in Deuteronomy 22 makes it amply clear that from a legal standpoint, Betula indicates sexual virginity. The required presentation of evidence for the girl's virginity in that discussion makes it impossible that this term could mean anything else but sexual virginity. Judges 19:24, here is my virgin daughter. No qualification for Betula, and it's hard to imagine what else Betula could mean other than virgin. 2 Samuel 13:2, she was a virgin. No qualification for Betula, and in the context of the story of sexual violation, it's pretty obvious that it means sexual virgin. Esther 2:17, the king loved Esther more than all the other virgins. No qualification for Betula. So when you say...
When the word Betula was used in the Hebrew scriptures, in many cases it had a qualifying statement attached to it.
That is total bullshit. That's not to say that there can't be instances where Betula is used more generically to refer to young women. It can even be used to refer to abstract entities like the nation of Israel, because language is expressive and the biblical authors use metaphor and allegory and, dare I say, fiction, especially in the writings of the prophets. There are many places where the JPS translation has the less sexual term maiden rather than virgin, perhaps because they see the term as being something less clinical than biological virginity. So look, if we were talking about a legal text, Betula would probably be the correct term for virgin. But the prophecy of Isaiah is poetry, so in any case it's hard to say the poet should have used this word or should have used that word. One alternative to Alma, which would be Isha, definitely suggests more of a family situation, and maybe that's not the image that Isaiah wanted to conjure, favoring a more primitive image of reproduction. I don't know. But again, the fact that the woman is pregnant effectively rules out the virgin possibility. If I said I saw a peacock at the zoo lay an egg, then you would know I'm actually talking about a peahen. The fact that the peafowl laid an egg is all the information that you need to know to make the diagnosis, despite whatever term I used.
And by contrast, Alma never requires qualifications. It implies a young, unmarried woman, which in ancient Israeli culture assumed virginity unless otherwise stated.
And it is otherwise stated because it states that she is pregnant. How much better could you state it? But let me just try something out here. Let's say that despite the past tense grammar, that the pregnancy actually is a prophecy of the future, near or far. And let's say that the author actually did mean virgin. The virgin will conceive, just as you want everyone to read it. Am I right? The virgin will conceive. Still, why on earth would you assume she would still be a virgin after she conceives? She's a virgin today, but after she has sex and conceives, she is obviously no longer a virgin. If I go to a Little League game and I say that child will be one of the greatest baseball players of all time, I don't mean they will still be a child when that happens. I'm not imagining an 8-year-old playing shortstop for the Yankees. And if I say the virgin will conceive and have a child, I'm not imagining that she's still a virgin when that child is born. This all seems so obvious. So even if you use the translation of virgin, you'd still have to be reading the passage in an exceptionally contrived way to have it portray a virgin birth. And there's no reason to do that.
So the Septuagint translators, all Jewish scholars, chose the Greek word parthenos once again.
And once again, we cannot definitively say that.
Which means virgin, reflecting their understanding of the passage. So
I thought you said it might or might not mean virgin. Now it definitely does?
This was not a Christian change or a Christian swipe of words.
How do you know it wasn't?
Sleight of hand. It was a Jewish translation made centuries before Jesus' birth.
And we don't have it. We only have manuscripts tended by Christians from hundreds of years later.
You know, I heard someone say once, like, you can either believe in the virgin birth of Jesus or the virgin birth of the universe.
What?
Right.
Which is a little simplistic, but it's clever because it's kind of saying, look, whatever you believe, there's an element of faith. You know, if you believed in the Big Bang that created the universe, something caused that we don't quite understand.
Well, whatever. Can we get back to discussing the Isaiah prophecy?
If you believe in miracles and the supernatural, there's things that have happened that go a little beyond our understanding and take some level of faith.
Yeah, but we're just trying to establish whether the text supports a certain reading. If you just want to make up things based on faith, then your entire video is pointless. Go and enjoy making things up.
And so I think that, you know, I think you've made a really strong case. People at that time, at the time of Jesus, were understanding that prophecy to be about a virgin birth. But
we don't know that at all, as I said.
To believe in a virgin birth does take faith.
Hell yeah, that's why you look for a more mundane reading of the prophecy, which is actually staring you right in the face. The woman is pregnant and will give birth. Before the child is 2 years old, the 2 kingdoms threatening Judah will be destroyed. That's the prophecy. Yes, it has some vivid and jarring imagery, as almost all prophecies do, but that's the whole of it. So there's no reason to use up your faith points on something that is pretty easy to understand rationally. If someone tells me his car is possessed by demons, yeah, that's some vivid language, but I don't need to take a leap of faith and assume I need to call the exorcist. I can save my leap of faith for something else, because there's a much more reasonable explanation.
Right? I don't think anyone's saying, like, that's a simple thing to believe and understand. But if we believe in a God who is involved in human history, not removed, the way that he is going to come into this world is going to have a miraculous element to it. In Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve are in the garden, God tells them before they leave Eden, a descendant of Eve, a descendant of a woman, will ultimately defeat the serpent.
No, it doesn't. It says that humans will strike at the head of the snake, and the snake will strike at the human's heel.
Right? And so there's this idea baked, like, in the very first passages of the Bible, God is going to, through a woman, bring about his redemption plan.
That's all in your imagination, of course. Can we get back to Isaiah?
Mm-hmm.
And so for Jesus to be born of a virgin really ties all the way back to that original promise.
It was a curse, not a promise. God is cursing the snake. Did you forget that part?
That it was, you know, Eve who first sinned, and then it was Eve who was going to bring about the redemption, and the light of the world was going to come through her. The defeat of the enemy was going to come through her. That's her revenge, right?
Well, sounds like a cool title for a movie, Eve's Revenge, but no, that's not in the Bible at all. You're just making up a story, and maybe you don't even realize that. Eve also gets her own curse in the next verse.
And so it all really connects in the whole of the scriptures. And I think we have to interpret these passages in those meta narratives as well, not just in isolation.
In other words, you're saying you have to interpret the Old Testament as predicting events in the New Testament. I mean, obviously that's what you're doing, and that's what Christianity is doing, and that's what Christianity has been doing since the New Testament was written. The gospel authors find an Old Testament prophecy like Isaiah 7:14 and adjust the Jesus narrative to fit the way they read that text. They were reading the Greek version, so they conjured up a virgin birth. And then you say, wow, it's amazing how the Old Testament anticipates the New Testament and how it all ties together. Yeah, that's exactly the way they wrote the New Testament. They tied it into the Old Testament. It was extremely deliberate.
Do they
Right.
make sense in that broader story?
So I have here some rabbinic commentary from the Talmud, which talks about the Hebrew scriptures being written in Greek. And I just want to read some of this because it's very interesting. Because people talk about the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language that you must study from Hebrew, or else you're really never going to get the context. And in the Talmud here, in Megillah 8b, it says, Mishnah, the difference between Torah scrolls and phylacteries and mezuzot, in terms of the manner in which they are written, is only that Torah scrolls are written in any language, where phylacteries and mezuzot are written only in Hebrew and using Hebrew script. So this states that the phylacteries, or the tefillin, and the mezuzot have to be written in Hebrew, but the Torah scrolls are written in any language. And here's another one which is really from the same place in the Talmud. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even with regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek. Torah scrolls written in any other language do not have the sanctity of a Torah scroll.
First of all, only in Greek is understood to mean only in Greek other than in Hebrew. That much should be obvious. And that last part about Greek having sanctity or whatever is the English translator's interpolation. That is not part of the Mishnah, as you can see, and I'm not sure why it's there.
So there's a little bit of a contradiction there within this in one passage, but at the same time, it says here that the sages permitted the Hebrew scriptures to be written in Greek.
What's your point? We don't know whether Torah scrolls ever actually were written in Greek. This may be an entirely theoretical discussion, as is the case for a lot of Talmudic debate.
But isn't that so fascinating? Because the New Testament is written in Greek.
Yes!
I've never put that together. That's so interesting.
Whoa there. Sorry, what is so fascinating about that? There were Greek-speaking Jews, there were Aramaic-speaking Jews as well, and there were translations of the Torah into Aramaic as well. The reasoning in the Talmud for why a Torah scroll could be written in Greek is that it was thought to be the language of the biblical Japheth in the rabbinic imagination, for whatever reason. I don't know. But why is that useful for this discussion?
Yeah, which is important to bring up the rabbinic commentaries, because
If you're interested in the rabbi's opinions on matters, perhaps you should consider that rabbinical tradition never translated Alma as virgin and never regarded Isaiah's prophecy as a prediction of Jesus' birth. Is that also interesting to you?
I mean, it's so drilled into society that Jewish society, that Christian beliefs are so non-Jewish, and they're so far. It's such a new and invented thing, but when in reality, there's so much similarity to the way that the ancient sages in Judaism saw the text, saw the Old Testament, and how they interpreted it.
That may be true in some cases, but in the case we're actually talking about, there is very little commonality. Rabbinical tradition does not regard the woman in question as being a virgin, and it seems like you put some weight on rabbinical insight since you were just reading to us out of the Talmud. So why not accept, along with the rabbis, that this is not a prophecy about a virgin?
In a very, very similar way. So I think that's pretty powerful. Jesus fulfilled these messianic prophecies, and Matthew's use of the Septuagint aligns with pre-Christian Jewish understanding. So with that,
No, we don't know that at all. The Alexandrian community was not representative of the Jewish world. We don't know who made that translation or whether that even was the translation, and there's no evidence that Jewish scholarly tradition has ever regarded that text as referring to a virgin birth, and certainly not a virgin birth 700 years in the future. So, I think that by far the most reasonable interpretation of the prophecy is what I already said. The pregnant woman is a literary device meant to vividly convey the speed with which the two antagonistic kingdoms will come to ruin. I'm sorry, but anything beyond that is just your own imagination and fantasy.